Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to today's very special Chabura. It's great to have you with us. Before we get into the program, I just want to share some very exciting news that some of you may have already seen. The publishing house of Chabura called Dart Press, we've just released Truth from All Sources. It's in our latest book. It's a translation of a fascinating letter written by Rav Eliyahu ben Amozeg, and it's a passionate defense or response to the critics, where he defends the tradition of integrating Torah and worldly wisdom and science, and really addresses some of the questions that we at the Chabura love discussing. Can wisdom be learned from other nations, and these sorts of questions. So definitely order your copy. It's available on the Dart Press website or on just Amazon if you search Truth from All Sources. I'll put a link on the chat, so for those who want to go into it after the shiur. Okay, so now on to today's session. I'm delighted to introduce Jackson Gardner. We love to do this every so often. We have some of our Talmidim, some of our up-and-coming scholars to share Torah and ideas with us. And today we have the privilege to have Jackson with us, talk about Rav Saadia Gaon and the influence that he had on the Andalusian Chachamim and the Sephardi Judaism more broadly. Jackson holds a bachelor's in neuroscience with a minor in Jewish studies from Emory. After studying at Yeshivat Darchei Noam in Yerushalayim, he now lives in New York and is pursuing both medical studies at Einstein and professional rabbinic training. Jackson is passionate about halachic methodologies and the Andalusian tradition, and in particular, we're going to focus on Rav Saadia today. Without further ado, Jackson, all yours.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Just a disclaimer, I'm actually not pursuing rabbinic yet. I'd like to in the future, but medicine is enough as is, so maybe one day. Thank you all for having me. So I just wanted to quickly introduce Rav Saadia and who he was before we get started. So Rav Saadia Gaon was born in Fayumi, Egypt, where he grew up most of his early adult life. At around the age of, I want to say 20, so this was in the early 900 AD, he moved to Tiberia, where he studied for many years. Tiberia at the time was a very big center of Torah. That's where one of the major Masoretic schools was in fixing the proper accents and pronunciations of the Tanakh text. A lot of piyutim were being written there, a lot of distinct practices, which were perhaps not always in accordance with the Bavel practices. And of course, Egypt and the land of Israel were very big hotbeds of Karaite activity, who at the time were probably the biggest opponent of rabbinic Judaism. So Rav Saadia really got a very unique education. Many of the Geonim had been born and raised in Bavel, and that's all they knew. Rav Saadia Gaon, however, in contrast, really got both worlds, because after being in Egypt and Israel, he moved when he was in, I believe, his 30s to Surah, which was one of the two Talmudic academies. Surah was founded by the first generation Amora Rav a few hundred years prior. And since then, it had been one of the two major centers. It was Surah and Pumbedita. Surah was eventually also the home of Rav Asher, who created and began the process of the Talmud as we know it, the Bavli. So Rav Saadia joined the Surah Academy, and a few years later, he was appointed the Gaon. So when he became the Gaon, he really had a large amount of knowledge under his belt from all these different places. And his main goal really was to educate the people as much as possible. I think we tend to look at Harambam as the pinnacle of education. Harambam, of course, wrote many works in especially Arabic to make it as accessible as possible to people. But Rav Saadia also did the exact same. So he wrote the Tafsir, which was an Arabic translation of most of Mikra, I believe. He also did the same Arabic translation to the Mishnah. He was the first to do so for the Mishnah itself. He wrote various halachic codes to allow people to review and understand the basic laws that they needed. And today, what we're going to be mostly talking about is his main philosophical work. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully this works. Can everyone see what's on the screen? Great. So the work that we'll be discussing is popularly called Ha'emunot ve'Hadeot. I recently learned this is not the official title that he concluded with. Rav Saadia wrote many different versions of this work, and we have a couple different manuscripts today. Rav Kafich writes that the final title of this work is actually called Hanivhar be'emunot ve'bedeot, because it's not just that Rav Saadia was trying to list out various ideas and views, he was trying to compile and determine for the reader what was going on. At this time, there were many different groups, both rabbinic, Karaite, also non-Jewish. Bavel was a very big academic center. Many of the Geonim interacted with other religious figures and scholars, and so what was the average person to do in these types of environments who were encountering different people with different views? What was a person to think, both, rabbinic versus Karaite, but also Jewish versus non-Jewish? And so Rav Saadia composed this work to show all these views together and show the person what the path correctly should be. And so this work became very popular. I just quoted at the top here this statement of Hacham Avraham ibn Daud. He is a very early Andalusian figure, most famously known for the work Sefer HaKabbalah, which discusses the direct link between the Geonim and the Andalusian figures. But he also has a work that's less known called Emunah Ramah, which was a philosophical work, mostly discussing different Greek philosophies at the time, how that fits into Judaism. I don't think today most people know about this. It was unfortunately overshadowed somewhat by Harambam, and so it's not as well known. But in the Hakdamah to this work, he discusses the problem in his day in Andalusia that there weren't that many books discussing these types of topics. However, he does make one exception. Right, he says, "B'shi'ur ma'shelo yirshiatiko archav le'emet imunatam zulati sefer Rabbeinu Saadia zatzal asher karu sefer ha'emunot ve'hadeot v'u sefer hetiv bo me'od yigamalenu ad halatov." There's not much out there for us to depend our views on, except for this one work. And he discusses later that it's not complete. There are new issues that have arisen that need to be discussed. Nevertheless, this work was considered a big foundation. And then I just placed below that Rav Kafich in his Hakdamah to Sefer Yetzirah and Rav Saadia's commentary to that work. I just think that this is a very beautiful quote by Kafich, that ultimately there was no area of Torah that Rabbeinu Saadia did not touch. And not only that, but everyone took from his Torah, no matter where you were. And that in Rav Kafich's eyes, when we learn things like Mikra, everyone else is a Yesh Omrim. Rav Saadia is the Ikar. He is the one that we hold by in all of these things. And so what I'd like to show briefly in surveying different ideas from Rav Saadia's main work is that as you study Rav Saadia's work, you will find a lot of connections between what Rav Saadia taught and what we find in Harambam especially, but also the Ibn Ezra, Yehuda Halevi. Obviously at the top we have this Hakdamah that Ibn Daud was also drawn after this work. And so really, Rav Saadia is, in many respects, I feel, the pillar of not just the Geonim who came after him, who also write based on his ideas, but also the Andalusian derech that us at the Habura are very passionate about learning about and discovering. So with that, I'm going to start with the first source. I titled this Breaking Mythical Thinking in Ta'ameh HaMitzvot. This is not necessarily his main focus of this portion of his work, but it's more of a side point. But I wanted to start with this because I couldn't help but notice the parallel between what he says and what we find later in Harambam. So Rav Saadia says, he's talking about the laws of Tumah and Tahara, which typically are not practiced for the most part today. ושתיקר בעיניו התפילה אחר שפסק ממנה ימים, ושעיקר בעיניו הקודש והמקדש אחר שנמנע ממנו ימים, שישוב ליבו ליראת שמיים. So he's saying that the point in his view, perhaps, of Tumah and Tahara is that a person thinks more dearly about himself. and it enhances the value of that person and his tefillah, because he doesn't just take for granted that he can walk wherever he wants, he can pray whenever he wants. There was originally a decree that certain types of tumah prevented a person from learning Torah. And so says Rav Saadia, these things essentially teach the person how to hold these things in awe, to have yirat shamayim, particularly when he enters the mikdash, that you're not just able to go into the mikdash whenever you want. You have to have certain times where you can and certain times where you cannot. And later in the Moreh HaNebuchim, we find that Harambam says actually the exact same thing. He says it's evident the object of giving different degrees of sanctity to different places. And he lists, you have the Temple Mount, you have the Ezrat Mashim, you have other things. These are all trying to add reverence and respect for these areas. That people do not just walk anywhere they want. There has to be a certain yirah that these things generate. This is a very small point in Rav Saadia's work, but I think this just goes to show you the great connection between Rav Saadia and those who come after him. And Rav Kafik, I believe, writes in the Moreh and his Hakdama to it that Harambam certainly studied Rav Saadia's works. Many of the things he writes in Moreh and other places are based on his Rav Saadia's own explanations and views. So now we're going to move into a more, I guess, philosophical, deeper concept. We're not going to explore the details, the nitty-gritty of these things. It's more to show the through line from Rav Saadia to these other thinkers. The first thing which Rav Saadia focuses on is the creation of the world. At this time, it was a big debate. Is the world created from nothing? Is the world created from something, multiple gods, prime matter, a lot of different theories out there. It's worth noting when we talk about creation from nothing, that's not to say that these thinkers felt that God metaphorically says poof and the world comes into being. Rav Saadia writes in his commentary to the Sefer Yetzirah the various processes of science in his day that he felt created the world, but nevertheless, the core of the belief is that God exists, nothing else exists, and then God creates the world from nothing. And so after stating this view, Rav Saadia then begins to list other views, which he begins to reject in various ways. So I just wanted to bring this one, which I think is very important. Rav Saadia says, they think that God creates other things from his own essence, essentially. So these people don't contradict or dispute that there is a creator. But they're not able to deal with the fact that there's creation from nothing. There has to be a pre-existing creation from something that was already there. So what do? Says Rav Saadia, this clearly led them to think that God creates the world from his own essence, which is the only thing that was in existence. And Rav Saadia says, of course, these are more foolish even than the initials. And when he's talking about the initial, it's the eternal prime matter and other Greek views. He does not like this view. And he goes on to just say, these are people who, they're so foolish and they're so unwilling to accept the view of creation from nothing that they've essentially fled one problem into an even greater problem, which is that most philosophers at this time held, as did Rav Saadia and others, that God is not affected by anything, God is perfect, God cannot change, etc. So if your problem is that the world was created from nothing, but your solution is God creates it from himself, you've essentially broken your fundamental philosophy by saying God cannot change, but now he can change. He made something from himself. So Rav Saadia is not a fan of this. And so moving into Harambam, so Harambam talks here about the 10 intelligences, which was a very big Neoplatonic theory of creation. And what Harambam is demonstrating here is the intelligence which moves the uppermost sphere cannot be the absolute being. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of intelligences and spheres, but suffice to say back then, without things like gravity and scientific theories of our time, They felt that there were intelligent incorporeal forces which allowed the different planetary spheres to move in a, of course, back then geocentric view. So Rambam says that cannot be God because that intelligence of the sphere has a common property to the other spherical intelligences. You have 10 spheres of planets, 10 intelligences that move them. So the very top one, perhaps I could say, oh, well, that's God. That's, the topmost, the God of the gaps, quote unquote. And says Rambam that that's not true. All these intelligences have something in common. They all move something, and therefore they have a shared aspect, says Rambam, and they have a unique aspect. There's something that makes number 10 different from number 2. And therefore, none of these can be, as he says, the first cause, which is another reference to God in Rambam's writings. Because God is, number 1, not a plurality, and number 2, wholly unique. There's nothing that he shares with anything, right? So again, the idea being that God does not create the world from himself. Everything else is distinct. And I bolded the 10 intelligences because in many respects, the Kabbalistic views of the 10 Sefirot are modeled in a Neoplatonic 10 intelligence system. But there's a fundamental difference. The difference is that for Rambam and Rav Saadia and others, these 10 intelligences are a scientific view which is separate from God. They determine how God created the world and how things came about. But that does not mean that they are God or that they are a Godhead of intelligences. And so to contrast that briefly, I brought Ramban. Part of my motivation for this shiur is I heard someone a few months ago speak about the importance of Ramban, that Ramban represents the Hashkafa of Judaism, in their words. And I reject this in many respects. And I also find that when we look at Rav Saadia and the Geonim and the Andalusian Derech, we find that Ramban is totally foreign to them, which makes sense. Ramban is taking his views from figures like the Ravad, Rav Yitzhak the Blind, and other French Kabbalists of Provence and France and Germany, which he himself in Catalonia absorbed. And so, as such, Ramban really represents a totally different view. And so I'm just excerpting a couple of his more esoterics from Bereshit. So in his Hakdama to Bereshit, he says, he talks about the fact that the whole Torah, in his view, are names of God, divine, magical names. He says, Ki ilu tachshov al derech mashal, ki pasuk Bereshit, yithalek letevot acherot, kegon, berosh yitbara Elohim. So said Ramban, I could take that pasuk and I could split the words a little bit differently to say in the beginning, God created himself. Yitbara, it's a hitpa'el reflexive. What does that mean in Ramban's thought? So he continues later in his work. He says, "Aval im tizke v'tavin sod milat bereshit v'lama lo hikdim lomar Elohim bara bereshit." Right? It says bereshit bara Elohim. Why does it not say Elohim bara bereshit? Says Ramban. He says teda ki al derech haemet, which is the Kabbalah for him. Hakatuv yagid v'taktonim v'yiramoz be'elyonim. It's talking about the creation of our world, but it's really alluding to the Godhead Sephirotic system. And therefore, says Ramban, the Ramban, umilat bereshit tirmoz bechokma, which is one of the Sefirot, shehi reshit hareshim, kasher hizkarti wilchak targumo b'targum Yerushalmi bechokmata. So he connects this to the Targum Yerushalmi, and then he says, "V'hamila muchteret beketer bet." The bet has a little crown in the Sefer Torah, which alludes to the keter, Sephira. So in Ramban's theology, essentially, he is reading this, the complete opposite of what Rav Saadia read. Right? Rav Saadia says God creates the world from himself. This is foolish. It's not correct. Ramban says the opposite. He says, no, it's alluding to God creating his own Godhead, which is above, which generates the below through these 10 emanations. And he goes further later in the text and says on the idea that God, it's says that's nafach be'apav nishmat haim, right? God breathes the soul, the living soul into man. What does that mean? So says Ramban that what it means is that this nefesh that we received, he says, gam lo behishtal shalut min hasechalim hanivdalim. It's not from the separate intelligences, which are what Rambam is talking about. Aval hiruach Hashem hagadol mipiv dat udvuna ki hanofech be'apav acher min nishamato yiten bo. This is directly from the Spirit of God. So again, says Ramban, the world is created from part of God's Godhead. Our souls are part God himself. This is essentially the opposite of the Andalusian Gaonic derech that Rav Saadia and Rambam are espousing. So I wanted to just bring that to show the contrast in the two views, and that Rav Saadia would not have viewed any of this in the same way. And so to go into another somewhat similar topic of souls, we have Gilgul. So I'm sure many of you have heard of Gilgul, maybe as a joke, maybe as a serious topic, but there are many works in the Lurianic system written about Gilgul, transmigration of souls, the idea that one person dies, his soul enters someone else, or a child dies and their soul was really the soul of a prior generation. Perhaps it goes into a non-human or a non-human to a human, etc. Shadeh Gilgulim is a very famous Kabbalistic work written many centuries ago on this topic. Many Kabbalistic Mefarshim on Tanakh itself talk about different characters in the text being resurrected, transmigrated versions of prior figures in the text. Ramban himself alludes to this when discussing the idea of yibum, of Leviritic marriage, that the whole point is the deceased brother's soul transmigrates into the new child, allowing them to truly live again in the next generation. So on this topic, Rav Saadia does actually write about it, and he does not like this either. He says, Avad Omar, Shanashim Mishaniklim Yehudim, they call themselves Jews, Metzatim Omrim Behishanut, Bekorim Oto Ha'ataka. So they talk about this idea of metempsychosis or transmigration. V'inyano. אצלם שלוח ראובן תשוב אל שמעון, ואחר כן בלוי, ואחר כן ביהודה, ויש מהם רבים שאומרים, יש פעמים שתהיה רוח האדם בבהמה, ורוח בהמה באדם, it's going different people, different types of, creatures, animals, man, etc. And he says, he doesn't like this, ודברים רבים מזה שיגעון והערבוב, this is foolishness, it's stupidity. And then he says, "V'histakalti b'masha choshvim she'avim el hama'amar hazeh v'matzatim arba'a shivushim." There are four core mistakes here. We're not going to go into all of them, but I wanted to just point out in his language. He says, "V'ani ro'eh l'zecharam la'ashiv alehem v'tichilat zeh shehu machzik b'dat haruchniim." So the dat ruchniim is the idea of the spiritualists, which we talked about previously, that God creates the world from his own essence, that you die, your soul is from God, that godly soul can go into someone else because they're all from God, essentially. He says, no, it's the same line of mistaken thinking from these other views. This is not what we should hold in our heads. There are other views which this is pulling from. So these people don't typically know this, says Rav Saadia, but they're taking it from these types of people. He also mentions the dualists, right? The Zoroastrian religion believes in a ultimate good and ultimate bad deity constantly at war with one another. So Rav Saadia also rejects the view of Gilgul, which those who follow in his footsteps continue to do so. The next thing, which is again related, is the explanation of the term B'Tselem Elokim. Rav Saadia, when he explains this in his work, he explains the pasuk V'yivra Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elohim bara'oto ve'va'er shezeh al derech ha'agdala ve'hashivut. It's talking about the importance of the person. It's not saying that God that made man and that we look like God, or that our form is in any way directly related to God, says Rav Saadia. No, it's purely the idea of importance of man. V'hu kasher kol ha'artzot shelo. Right, God created all of the lands we have, but he says, this is my land. What does that mean? This is my land. It says Rav Saadia, it's saying, this is to me the most important land for you to know about. This is my mountain. I've made all the mountains, but this is what I think is important. So again, says Rav Saadia, this is derech ha'ichud ve'askula. It's not hagashma. This is not a materialistic pasuk. This is not how we understand it. This is purely dealing with the importance of man, man's abilities, man's power, his importance, not at all a direct linkage, which again, at least what we saw with Ramban, would be a direct contradiction. And in fact, Ramban directly on this pasuk says that the word tselem is the same as the word to'ad. The word to'ad typically means the appearance, right? The direct face or physical features of someone, right? Yefet to'ad, for example. And so Ramban views that as the same, that we are made in the tselem of God, literally, as a physical image. And Rav Saadia rejects this, as does Harambam, who says here, Rambam has a question. We see that the term tselem is used also for idols, right? For fesidim. Why? What is the understanding of that? Why is that the linkage? Says Harambam, the reason that it's used also for these idols is because they are worshipped on account of the idea they represent, not the figure, not the shape. And this is an important concept that I want to touch on very quickly in pagan and idolatrous thought, which people might not be aware of, some of you might be, that pagans in the ancient world did not believe that a statue was the god, right? There was no view that the statue in the temple was the deity I'm worshiping. The view of the pagan was the statue is a device which channels the divine energy from said god. I have a statue, I perform a ritual, the god favors me and puts his energy into the statue. That statue is now activated and I can use it for my own benefits. This is why in the literature of Chazal, in Avodah Zarah, Chazal is obsessed with the idea of when is Avodah Zarah bitul by the non-Jew. Because as soon as the non-Jew has nullified the idol and said, this doesn't have any power, I reject all of these, so then it's completely mutar to deal with that object. It's only when the non-Jew has activated it in this type of ritual that it becomes asur on the Torah level, according to Chazal. And so Harambam is also promoting this proper view of paganism, that it's all about what it represents. It's all about the power and the ability, not the actual resemblance of the idol to anything. And so he, again, is pulling the same idea as Rav Saadia here in Rav Saadia's work. This next bit, I'm not going to read directly. It's very long, very complex. I'm happy to share the source later. But I want to touch on it outside. It's the idea of actionable attributes and especially this idea of negative theology. So a big problem that Rav Saadia and others had to deal with was the descriptions of God, not physically, but his attributes. God is, angry, or God is said to be upset, or God is said to be kind, or we say God is living and he's omnipotent. What does this mean, right? Christians especially loved at this time to use these things as proof of the Trinity, right? That there are three different aspects to the Godhead, which are in one sense a single entity, but in another sense represented by three distinct things, right? The Father, Son, etc. And so Rav Saadia and others have to deal with this and what exactly these attributes are used for in Tanakh and in literature of Chazal. And in doing so, Rav Saadia writes this very long explanation, which I will briefly summarize. Essentially, what Rav Saadia is saying here is that the three main attributes, which many were very emphatic on at the time, that God is living, that God is omnipotent, and that God is omniscient. So, right, God is not, God is still present, right? God can do anything. God is aware of everything. Says Rav Saadia, these are not separate ideas. These are just things which we learned about when we found out that God made the world. Says Rav Saadia, when I know that God made the world, well, someone who makes the world has to be aware of it, has to be able to do it, has to be active in the world, etc. So what this really represents, says Rav Saadia, is just the person, right, our human understanding of what the idea of a creator is. And says Rav Saadia, we can't make a single word to represent that, because then we'd have to explain the word. How do you, I could make up a word for this, but then I'd have to just break it into three more words and say, well, this really means X, Y, and Z, right? And so because of that, these three attributes are really just ways in which we understand God's role in the world. Because we know God created the world, we give him these types of attributes. Because as Rav Saadia continues, and as they held back then, God does not have mutability. God does not change. God does not actually have any sort of emotion or any types of actual descriptions. And so these are just ways for humans to understand God's role in the world, his, actions, right? Through God's action of creating the world, I have these attributes to describe what that is. And this becomes very important in the Andalusian theology. I brought from the Sefer Kuzari in the second Halak, after the Khazar king has converted to Judaism. One of his biggest issues at first is, I see all these descriptions of God, all these names of God. What does that mean? I thought you told me God is incorporeal, doesn't change, etc. So how do you explain that? And so says the Chaver, the rabbinic figure who is learning with the Khazar king, that you have the Shem HaMeforash, right? The four-letter name of God. That is a unique description of God. We will not today be dealing with what that means in the different views of these figures, but rather everything else, says the rabbinic figure in this work, they're all just attributes that describe God, right? They're just derived, right? Says the Chaver here, right? Habruim lo kefi gezerotav u'ma'asav, right? They're based on his actions and his decrees for us and for the things around us, right? Which is what Rav Saadia is saying also. However, the Kuzari adds an additional category, which is perhaps somewhat derived from Rav Saadia's views, which is ha-shaliliot. So these are negations. So in the view of the Kuzari, when we say that God is living, it's really a negation that he's not dead, right? Because God cannot have attributes. And if you believe God cannot have attributes, even when we say God is living, it just means God is not dead. When I say God is one, it just means God is not many, right? Because when I say unity in a humanistic term, I am one, for example, but my body is made of, millions of tiny little cells and other things that make me who I am as a unity. And God forbid we should say that God is the same way, that he is made of many different parts which combine into a unity. And so when we say God is one, we're just negating that God is many. And this idea of negative theology that we see here is emphasized repeatedly by Harambam. It's arguably one of his most important methods, which he talks about in the Moreh HaNevuchim. In the Moreh, in the first Halak, Harambam is guiding the reader slowly but surely through how to understand and conceptualize of God. A proper understanding of God is tantamount in Harambam's theology. It's a major, major aspect of it, as it was in these other thinkers, as we see. They spend much time also talking about it. And so Harambam says, right, you should know that these negative attributes, they are the true attributes, because they do not have any incorrect notion or deficiency in reference to God whatsoever, right? So the negative attributes, they are just negating what God is not, right? They're saying God is not like anything else. Positive attributes, right, descriptive attributes like we spoke about, so okay, we can use them, but they're not as crystal clear to the person that God is unique and God cannot be linked to anything. And so again, this is a big through line from Rav Saadia to these thinkers. Now for a somewhat more easy to understand and more fundamental idea that Rav Saadia is very big for publicizing. The methods in Peshat. Rav Saadia wrote 2 commentaries on Torah. Unfortunately, we do not have the longer, more philosophical one. The Ibn Ezra quotes it at times, which is nice. I think in Masada Rav Kook's publication, there are a couple fragments that they've been able to recover with Kafik's help. But really, we just have his short Perush, which is mostly definitions of words and sentences, which is still very nice, and it helps us also. And through learning others, for example, Ibn Ezra, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Harambam, also on Bereshit and Shemot, often will cite the same types of commentaries as well. We can kind of recreate some of what Rav Saadia would think. Nevertheless, in his work, he writes this very fundamental concept that I think a lot of us perhaps take for granted, but that he was really the first to explicitly write this in a work for people. And so he says, "V'hu she'anachnu kol bnei Israel me'aminim, ki kol asher b'sifrei ha'nevi'im hu kasher nireh mimashmeo v'yadua mimlotav, ela ma shenireh hayadua mimenu mevi el echad me'arba davarim." Right? So we're taking things literally. We're not saying everything's a metaphor. We want to read things the way they seem. However, there are 4 situations where that's just not possible, says Rav Saadia. We're not going to go into all of them, just some of them. So he says one option, im lahachish muchash kemo shene'amar al chava. So one option is it's going to contradict my, ability of sense perception, what I see around me. So on chava, with Adam and Chava at the beginning of Bereshit, it says, Kihi haita im em kol chai. She's the mother of all living things. But that's not possible. Meaning, I know that Chava is not the mother of the lions in the desert, right? Or that she gave birth to squirrels. I know that she's the mother of all humanity. So says Rav Saadia, this is where, again, we have to take this as a bit of a metaphor. Oh, la'ashiv mash yesh besechel, kemo she'amar, ki Adonai Elohecha esh ochla, right? It says God is a consuming fire. So we spoke earlier about attributes, and says Rav Saadia, this is a case where I know that God is not literally a fire that consumes people. It's talking about, the idea that God exacts justice against those who commit wrongdoing, that God will consume them, that God will punish them. We cannot take this as a literal statement of fire. And just to show you, perhaps not a more extreme interpretation with this method of his, but a more interesting one, perhaps. So the Ibn Ezra brings this explanation. Whenever Ibn Ezra says Hagaon, it's always Rav Saadia Gaon, which also I think points to his importance in Ibn Ezra. That is Hagaon for him. And he does quote others like Shmuel Hofni Gaon, but this is the Rav Saadia is Hagaon. And so when we see in the Midbar, the pasuk V'iftach Adonai, he's talking about God opens the mouth of Balaam's donkey, and the donkey speaks to Balaam. Says Ibn Ezra, V'omar Hagaon ki lo divara haton. It did not speak. This is not a literal donkey opening its mouth and speaking, the language to Balaam. This is a metaphor. It means something else. What that means, not our problem right now, but just showing you that, again, the idea of metaphorical pshat and not contradicting what we see around us is very important. And even, I think it's important to note, even when we see these figures accepting a literal view based on something, it doesn't mean that we have to accept it. Meaning to say, they're accepting it based on the science and what they knew back then. Just as they did back then, I believe so too we today look at it from the same lens and reevaluate whether that still holds true. Another very big one, which Rav Saadia is popular for, in my opinion, Harambam is more so known for this, which is why I brought it. But it's a big idea that Rav Saadia actually, I think, first talks about, which Harambam then speaks about. So says Rav Saadia, Ani ro'eh lischor davar shehem omrim yirchavu bo hadvarim v'hu. I want to mention this thing which a lot of people are very adamant about. Shehem omrim kemo shahaita sibat ha'amin b'Moshe ha'amidu ha'otot v'ha'moftim. We believe that Moshe was a prophet because he did these miracles for us. Ki chayav shetieh hasibat le'amin b'zulato ha'otot v'ha'moftim. That means that I have to believe in other prophets for what they do miraculously. This is a very important claim at the time of Muslim theologians like the Kalamists. They would go to Jews and they'd say, you believed in Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophets because they did these amazing things. They would say, yeah, okay. And say, well, did you know Muhammad did the same things? He did all these miracles. So you need to believe in Muhammad. You need to become a Muslim. So says Rav Saadia, this is not why we believe in Moshe, right? Says Rav Saadia, v'tamati ba'et shami ze tamagadol. שסיבת האמיננו במשה לא הייתה אותות והמופתים בלבד, אבל סיבת האמיננו בו ובכל נביא, שיקראנו תחילה אל מה שיכשר, וכאשר נשמע דברו ונראה אותו שיכשר, נבקש ממנו המופתים עליו. I have to hear what you're saying logically first. If what you're telling me makes sense, then yes, I then will ask you to do some sort of miracle to show that you are in fact a prophet. But otherwise, why should I believe you? Says Rav Saadia. If I heard your claim and it's not correct, I'm not going to believe you and what you do if you're not making any logical sense to me whatsoever. So we don't believe in Moshe because of his miracles. We believe in Moshe because he gave us correct arguments before he performed his miracles. This is perhaps one of the bigger arguments that Harambam brings in both the Mishneh Torah, in Hilchot Yosodei Torah, and also here in the guide. What he says in explaining the narrative in Shemot between God and Moshe, that God first shows Moshe rational proof by which he can prove that God exists to the Jewish people. He has to make rational sense to them. The elders are not going to believe Moshe until he convinces them, hey, there is a God, and this is God, and he exists. And then they'll say, okay, great. But Moshe's problem is, well, how do I then prove that that God that you believe in now sent me as a prophet? And then God says, okay, I'll give you these signs of miracles. So Harambam is directly drawn after the same exact mode of thought as Rav Saadia, that we need miracles, but only after logic. I next wanted to bring another very important one of Rav Saadia. So Rav Saadia says that there are people, מתלמידי החכמים, מי שאמר, כי אין ראוי לאדם להתעסק בעולם הזה, ובדבר חוץ מן בקשת החוכמה. ואמרו, קיווה יגיע אל ידיעת מה שיש בארץ מהטובים והמזגים, ואל ידיעת הבורא ממו שבשמיים והכוכבים והגלגלים. ויש לו ערבות ותענוג לנפש. There are people who say, we want to learn. We want to get knowledge of God, of science. This is what gives the nefesh what it wants. This is the true reason that we exist. And says Rav Saadia, Matzati kol ma she'amru emet. They're right. Knowledge is the highest goal. It is what we're here to do. However, says Rav Saadia, aval makom hata'ut bo hu ma she'amru shelo yitasku b'davar zu'ata. They're saying, don't do anything else. V'im lo yitasku ima b'mazon u'machasav u'v'mistor tevatel. They're not going to survive without things like food, shelter. How could a person live like that? And says Rav Saadia, if they would think, well, they'll take care of me, they're going to feed me and give me all of what I need, they're not going to listen to them. They're going to be despised by the public. Rav Saadia is very adamant that people who learn, it is, obviously a very fundamental goal, but you cannot compromise taking care of yourself and those around you and making everyone else do so for you. Harambam gets a lot of flack sometimes for saying in the Mishneh Torah that you cannot benefit from Torah. You have to make a living. You cannot just be a freeloader who learns. And many ask, where's Harambam coming from? Why is he reading Chazal in this way? Well, we see it's not just Harambam. It's Rav Saadia Gaon. It's all those who draw after him who write the exact same message. Similarly, I'll say this more in a shorthand, that Rav Saadia here talks about when we study the law of Moshe, the Torah of Moshe, really it's the same as the Torah of Abraham. So Moshe added certain things like Shabbat, but says Rav Saadia, he did so similarly to a person who, they're saved on a certain day, and then they say, okay, in remembrance of that, I'm going to now do X. I'm going to fast as a remembrance. Rav Saadia's point here is that Moshe Rabbeinu commanded the Israelites to do certain things in Egypt and in the desert. However, those things were not the status of the actual Torah, which was given by God to the Jewish people. These were things which Moshe told the people, look, because of what's happening around us, we should do this. We should do that. He's suggesting these things through rational means for the people. And this idea is expanded beautifully by Harambam, who says that Abraham did not tell the people that God had sent him to them with these commands of what they should do. He didn't say, I'm a prophet, listen to me. Even when it was commanded, says Harambam, that they should all be circumcised, he does so, but he doesn't do so as a prophet. He does so by saying rationally, this is what I believe is true, and this is my connection with God, and I believe we should be doing this. And he convinces them, but not through prophecy. Also, says Harambam, this is Yitzhak, Yaakov, Levi, Kohat, Amram, etc. Says these thinkers, Rav Saadia and Harambam, it's only when God reveals himself at Har Sinai to the Jewish people, and all the Jewish people hear the revelation, they all communally accept the Torah and the covenant with God and appoint Moshe as their spokesman. But only they can appoint Moshe that way. Moshe was not allowed to come to them as a prophet and say, do X, Y, and Z. He had to convince them in his own human methods first. And it's only after the revelation where every single person is on a horizontal society level of every single person directly with God that we are allowed to then use prophecy in a legislative way. I finally just want to end talking about going back to knowledge, right? The highest human perfection. A lot of these thinkers talk about knowledge being incredibly important. Well, the word emunah is often used in these contexts. The Arabic for this word is actually itikad. Itikad is a type of intellectual investigation which leads to a person holding a certain view. So it's not really emunah in the way we conceptualize it. It's not a blind faith belief. It's an investigative sort of inquiring attitude that we have, which leads to us holding something. And so we see that Ibn Ezra in his main work, Yesod Morah V'Sod HaTorah, which is also a nice rhyme. He was a poet, that he says, only the wisdom of all of these different things, right? The constellations and sciences and values and generations. And later he writes also Talmud and Torah, etc. Only that knowledge can get the person to the high level of the nefesh, of the Malachei Elyon, Ha'olam Haba, etc. And so too, Harambam says here that the fourth kind of perfection, the true perfection, is the highest intellectual faculties of true, metaphysical views of God and the world. This is really the final human perfection. But Harambam does not stop there in the Moreh. He continues and says that Yirmiyahu, who he's using Yirmiyahu's nevuahs as an explanation of this topic, he doesn't stop with that idea. Instead, he says that man can only become elevated in this knowledge of God. But as we said earlier, we don't know anything about God because God doesn't change. God doesn't really have attributes. The only things I know about God are what his actions are manifested in the world. Things like chesed, mishpat, tzedakah, right? These are the things which we say God, does in the world. Harambam codifies a very important mitzvah to follow in the ways of God, which means to do chesed, to do mishpat, to do tzedakah, because that's really all we know. True knowledge of God is essentially knowing you know nothing, and knowing that all you can really know is the actions which God, manifests in the world. And so he continues that really, a person can get to the highest awareness he possibly can try of God and the knowledge of his providence and how God, performs chesed with people and tzedakah, etc. And then he will then seek these things and imitate the ways of God. And Tanabam continues, right? This is the person who essentially comes down the prophetic ladder of enlightenment of all this knowledge and uses it in the community around him. He does these things with other people. He educates them, he instructs them, he helps them, he guides them. This is, I believe, a big reason why Harambam and many of these thinkers were such prolific writers. Their goal was not just to achieve this knowledge and, hoard it to themselves and say, I'm the lucky one who gets Olam Haba now because I know these things. They're writing these works and saying, I want you to get there with me if you can, and I want to share this, and I want to lift everyone with me. And so I'll just end with this conclusion of a portion of Rav Saadia's work where he says the exact same thing. ומי שהשכיל לנפשו יהיה מן המשכילים, ומי שמתקן בני אדם לעבודת אלוהים, ולמדם מה שיגיע בו אליה, יהיה ממצדקי הרבים. It's like what is taught in Daniel, המשכילים יזכירו כזוהר הרקיע, ומצדקי הרבים ככוכבים לעולם ועד. ובעבור זה יצווה כל החם על ההשגחה, ובלמוד בני אדם בהשרים. Right? Once a person has understood these things and become a maskil, someone who's enlightened, he must then become the hacham who teaches others how to do exactly that. That is truly the way of all of us who become intelligent through these knowledges that we've acquired through these thinkers and through our own investigations. And so the final message I want to leave off with is one of the biggest messages I think that Rav Saadia pioneers and continues to enforce for all the Geonim and the Andalusian Jews and for us today. As we learn, as we discover these things, as we investigate these things through the Habura, through our own learning, we must not lose sight of the fact that our goal is to also lift others up with us and to take this knowledge and teach it and transmit it to as many as are willing in order to not just be the only people hoarding this knowledge, because knowledge is not for the person who attains it. Knowledge is for everyone who can attain it. And sometimes the person who attains it needs to also share it and help the other person attain it. It's only through this elevated goal that man can truly reach, I believe, his full potential. So thank you for all of your time. Happy to take questions if there is still time for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop share.
Thank you, Jackson. That was brilliant. And I don't know if I can use it, but thank you for being that maskil and for sharing it with us. And we look forward to having you again. The question I have, while maybe other people feel free to raise your hand or You can put in the chat if you feel you prefer that. You clearly showed a very strong case for Saadia Gaon being the major influence of Rambam and the other Andalusian Chachamim.
Mhm.
Are there any ways that you're aware of in which Saadia Gaon took a different approach, or in other words, they parted ways?
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple. Off the top of my head, the Ibn Ezra does tend at times to argue with him on the pshat of the text, definitions of certain words, grammar points, those types of arguments. Um, in terms of their larger views of Judaism, I am not aware of that many direct differences. I think the biggest difference I can think of between Rav Saadia and especially Harambam and Ibn Ezra and others is Rav Saadia, when dealing with the idea of Olam Haba, does feel that Olam Haba is a physical next world which is created. That at some point, when enough people have lived according to God's wisdom, all the righteous will be taken and transported to a completely new world. Our world will disappear, destroyed, new world will be created, the souls will be reconstituted as bodies. That's Olam Haba for Rav Saadia Gaon. Obviously, Harambam and others held that Olam Haba was a purely spiritual existence. So I would say that is probably one of the biggest differences. And the other difference I would say is subtler perhaps, and that is that Rav Saadia structures his arguments in a certain way, um, dealing with creation to prove the creation, to prove the creator, etc. Harambam does not necessarily hold by the same methods. He does perhaps hold by some of the same ideas, but he just feels that it's not as effective, let's say it, to communicating the same content. So
Thank you. There's a comment there, if you can see it. Mm,
yes, it's true. Christians also believe this, right? And in fact, ironically, even the Ramban himself, who I contrasted, says in his disputation with Pablo Cristiani that he says, look, if you're a Christian and you're raised with these ideas, then sure, it might sound normal. But for me, it sounds ridiculous, all of these miracles. Um, but absolutely, that is a big claim. I believe Haham Fa'ur points out that to believe in Christianity, you have to believe in the end, meaning that if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah and was resurrected, that is essentially what you need to believe to then retroactively believe everything before that. Whereas in Torah, it is the belief in God and the experience of revelation, which then generates what follows it. So yeah, it's a good point.
Reshit Chokhmah Yirat Hashem. Right.
Mhm.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Okay. Well, everything was so well explained and well presented that I think it's for us to process and internalize, and it's a fascinating discussion, which I know the Chabura very much, trying to look at. People think of Rambam and like, oh, where did you get this source from? And I think you've provided a very compelling case for that. Okay, we have one
That's a good
question.
question, yeah.
Feel free to unmute iPhone.
I'll give a question. So the Andalusians, they operated within, the Aristotelian framework that the philosophers of their time were working under, right? This led them to interpret, as you pointed out throughout the lecture, in a way that the ancients from the Torah time simply could not have thought of. I mean, have you ever given that much thought as a criticism to the rationalist approach of the Andalusians?
So I think that the most appropriate answer to that is the idea of the golden apples in silver filigree. The idea that a good mashal coats itself in, or a good idea, I should say, coats itself in the mashal. Meaning, yes, I think the science, uh, Aristotle, physics, all of that is very, medieval, ancient Greece, etc. And we do see that in the literature of Chazal and all the way through these figures and even later than that. Um, however, I would say that the fundamental ideas which these figures are talking about in terms of God's unity, his uniqueness, his attributes not being, actual attributes, but more actions and other references. I think that those are just based on the deeper ideas of the sources and Chazal, and I think that they're just couching it in whatever the science of their time is. For example, Ibn Ezra loves to talk about astrology. Rambam absolutely despises astrology and thinks that it's illegitimate. But when you look at the deeper teachings of the two of them, you find that they're still very similar in terms of how they view God, Malachim, Olam Haba, the soul, etc. So.
Okay. Any final questions? Okay. Well, on that note, thank you so much. I know we usually meet on Wednesdays, but I think it's fantastic that we do this every so often. On Sundays, we have people like Jackson and other up and coming scholars, Talmidim, clearly on their way being Talmidei Chachamim. So hopefully this inspires and encourages others as well to step up and be involved. Not necessarily everyone has to give a shiur, but the idea of the chabura is it's a chabura, and I think people can share. You don't necessarily need to be an expert on everything to be able to, give divrei Torah. We have different ways of doing it. It could be through writing, through shiurim like this, or just being involved on the WhatsApp group. I think that is, it's all important, and we really encourage people like you. So Jackson, thank you so much for your time, and everyone for being here. And just once again, a quick reminder that we just published the book of Truth from All Sources. If you're on the WhatsApp groups, I'm sure you are. If you're here, so you'll see the links there. And we'll see you on Wednesday. We continue with Rabbi Gingold Alchek's series on Rav Uziel's writings on Zionism. So we hope to see you there. And thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Jackson, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.